To this second session in our webinar series. So this session is going to be on implementing eConsent in REDCap. So I'm Claire West, I'm a senior programmer at Norwich CTU and going to be presenting along with my colleague Anthony Collis. If you were at last week's session or you just want to see a catch-up recording of it, it's the first one's ready to view on the sign up page that you've signed up to this session on. We'll put a link in the chat as well. We'll also send an email around about it, and as I said, after next week's session with a link to that and the slides for the sessions as well. So just to say what we're going to be covering today. So we're kind of giving a high-level overview of implementing eConsent in REDCap. So sort of how to get REDCap if you haven't got it already, different things you need to consider and requirements for an eConsent system. So a brief intro to what REDCap is and the parts of the eConsent form and how those are implemented in an electronic system. We're also going to be sending you showing you a quick demo of an eConsent system. So we'll send you a link to an online open system in REDCap for consenting, so you can view it as a participant. Should be useful if you've not used REDCap before particularly, and talking about something called external modules we've used. We're not going to be talking about a couple of things. So one of those is REDCap Cloud. So we're going to be talking about the community edition of REDCap. REDCap Cloud's a cloud hosted system that's run by a company for profit, and we haven't got experience in that implementation, and it has extra things. If you do, feel free to mention it in the chat. And also, it's actually quite a lot to cover, so we're not going to go into lots of technical details, screen sharing individual fields on REDCap, because there's lots of videos that do that. But also, if that is something you'd be interested in, we can do that and do screen sharing at next week's session, which will be more interactive and sort of question answering session. Also, just a kind of reminder, we're not experts, but a lot of our trials use eConsent now, and they're quite diverse. So we've come up against a lot of issues we've had to work around or solve, or experience in implementing it in a few different ways. So hopefully it'll be helpful, but equally, if anyone wants to share their experiences, please feel free. Also about this session, you saw we asked about your background sign up. So we've had of the about 163 signups we had this morning, you can see how the different different backgrounds you all have. So about 22% of people have already used REDCap free consent, which is great. So again, please feel free to share your experiences or thoughts on things too. But then the remaining about 80% split really evenly into those of you who already use REDCap but are looking into using it for eConsent, or those who haven't used REDCap at all. So hopefully there will be a little bit of something for everyone, but it's going to be good to cover just also what REDCap is, so at least you'll be able to navigate what we're talking about a bit if you haven't used it. And also just to quickly say the formats, please feel free to type any questions in the chat window. We'll try and cover some questions in the middle and in the end if we have enough time, and if not, as we said, at next week's webinar. Also, you can ask questions in the feedback form, which we can then answer at the next session. Something which we're going to use in this session, which shamelessly loved in the UK TMN, TMRP and CTU network talk on eConsent in January, was using Padlet. So hopefully Erica will share this in the chat as well, but I've set up a little Padlet page to aid discussions, which has the different sections that we're going to talk about in our talk. Just because it can be quite difficult to keep track of chat sometimes if there's lots of questions. So feel free to discuss there, and hopefully, it'll be easier to answer other people's questions. Similarly, we're planning to share some of the questions that people have raised or things we've discussed on a forum. So I thought we'd suggest using Trilaborate if you haven't registered for that now. It's quite quiet in places, but I thought it would be helpful for us to have a reference to come back to if you were talking about something and somebody had some really good advice you wanted to see. We'll try and post some topics on there later. Also, just to mention again, as Matt did last week, that this work's actually part of some money we've got from the NAHR to create a guidance document on implementing eConsent in REDCap and other EDCs. So hopefully we'll be completing that in the next few months, and we'll disseminate that as well. So that'll probably be on our website and via various networks. So just to let you know, that should be coming soon as well. And hopefully after this session, a kind of aim is for you to know what REDCap's suitable for, what kind of things you need to think about when you're planning an eConsent system and to be aware of, and how REDCap can help you do that. So what features REDCap has that makes that easier or is built in, and where to get more help, because obviously all the trials are different and have different requirements. So just signposting a few of those for you. So just pass over to Anthony now to do the next section.
Hi, thanks, Claire. So yeah, I'll do going to do this section about implementing eConsent in REDCap. Sort of note to start with is that there is an eConsent framework in REDCap, but it's not just a matter of switching it on and boom, you've got an eConsent system. A big part of the work involved in setting up eConsent is adding appropriate components, forms, fields, and add-ons to build an eConsent process which works for your study, meets your requirements and follows the regulations and mitigate risks, because one size does not fit all. So to start with a brief introduction for anybody who's not used REDCap before or maybe isn't so familiar with it. It's a secure web application for building and managing online services and databases for research. It's developed by a team at Vanderbilt University in the States, who are very kindly giving it away for free to non-commercial and academic research institutions to use. As a result of that, and as a result of what a good piece of software it is, it's extremely widely used. With it's just gone over 2 million users recently, all around the world in 145 different countries. It's got a very active community, which is always great for a piece of software. So there's a consortium with an online forum where you can ask questions. I'll talk a bit about that later, but it's a really helpful resource. And there's a lot of things we like about it. It's very useful. It's got an awful lot of different useful features built in. It's very flexible, and it's also easily extensible. So if there's a feature that it doesn't currently have, it's possible to write extra bits of software and modules that will plug into it to add those features. So how do you get hold of it? First step is to join the REDCap Consortium. If you go to this URL on the page here, it will give you information about how to get in contact with the REDCap team. You submit an application to join. They might ask you to prove that you're a non-profit organisation or an academic institution, which we needed to do before we can get hold of the software. You need to sort of also enter into a contract to agree not to sort of share or try and resell the software. But the next step would be to host it, because it is a self-hosted solution. Unless you go down the REDCap Cloud route, which Claire mentioned earlier, you will need a web server with PHP 7.2.5 or above, and MySQL database 5.5.5 or above, and some kind of email server, like an SMTP or a SendGrid. There is also, you can use other databases if you need to. There's MariaDB, but I think MySQL is probably the most widely used. So options for how to host it. I think probably the most common option, and it's a good option if you can do it, is to have the IT department at your institution host it, because then hopefully you've got the expertise to set it up in-house. If that isn't an option for you, it's also possible to host it on a cloud solution such as Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. For both of those, there are sort of templates and packages on the REDCap forum that will kind of streamline that process and make it a bit easier. And sort of other hosting options are available, sort of anywhere that's a suitably secure hosting service with PHP and MySQL you can use. To some extent, it will depend on the technical capacity in your team as well. So yeah, that will. And again, also, if there's anybody who's already using REDCap here in the seminar today, who can suggest good ways of hosting it, please do either add that to the chat or the Padlet, sorry. And yeah, sort of if you're looking for hosting solutions, also do ask in the chat, and we'll see if we can sort of facilitate that. But that's probably the biggest hurdle in getting up to use REDCap, is having somewhere to host it. So we're going to go through a quick glossary of terms that we might be using that are a bit REDCap specific. First of all, instrument is the REDCap name for a form, basically a form or a survey for entering data. Branching logic is when you have you want to hide or show fields based on the values of other fields. For example, if you have a drop-down list of options with an other option, you might want to, when people select other, reveal a text box for them to put in details. So that is what we mean by branching logic. External modules are packages of software which are sort of not part of the REDCap core code, but are written by members of the consortium, which you can download and plug into your REDCap to add extra functionality or behavior. They're very useful. We'll talk quite a bit about those later. Email alerts and notifications, that's a feature of recent versions of REDCap which will allow you to send out emails and in some cases text messages to either to your participants or members of the research team. And open as a survey, I think as we mentioned earlier in REDCap, you can have data entry forms that you have to log in to fill in, but you can also have an option to open these as a survey which the participants complete themselves, which can either be sent out by email or completed in person without being logged into REDCap. So a couple of the features that we find particularly useful for doing eConsent, and we'll go into these in more detail later, but as an overview, you've got the option to send automated emails. There's an audit trail built into REDCap, which will record when the data has been entered or edited and when each page has been viewed. It's obviously very important for regulatory compliance and for seeing what's happened with your data. There's an eConsent framework, which we'll talk about later. The ability to generate PDFs of your data entry forms and surveys. There's an e-signature feature. There's a very secure permissions system. So there's role-based permissions on REDCap where each user can be added to a different role with a different set of permissions. So they might have access to some parts of the database, but not others. And that also now includes two-factor authentication. So if you want to up the security of your system, you can have it send out text messages to the people have to use to validate their access, or emails. External modules, I've already mentioned briefly, and also the REDCap community, which is a great source of support. Quite often, if you've got something you don't know how to do, or you've got a question, you can post it on that forum and someone will be back with an answer within 24 hours. Or it's also a good place you can suggest new features for the developers to include. So first thing to think about if you want to implement eConsent in REDCap is what type of signature do you need? REDCap is good for when you need simple electronic signatures. So a typed name or sort of drawing your signature with a finger or a mouse pointer or a stylus. This sort of simple signature is sufficient for the majority of both CTIMP and non-CTIMP studies, according to the MHRA and NIHR guidance. What REDCap can't do, we feel, is more advanced or qualified signatures, where those are linked to the individual participant using more advanced methods. So if you were doing a higher risk study that involved higher risk than standard care, like a type B or C study, we think you'd need to find a different solution for that. But for simple signatures, REDCap can be very useful. So the next thing to think about is what the requirements of your individual study are, because as we mentioned, and as I'm sure you're all aware, all studies are different and have their own requirements, and these can have or do have implications for setting up an eConsent system. So probably the simplest scenario would be what we call a simple eConsent, where only the participant, you just need to collect consent from the participant electronically. Often, perhaps for a CTIMP or a more complex study, you might also want countersigning from the researcher. So the participant consents electronically, and then the researcher completes a form to confirm that they've witnessed that consent. Another feature to think about is whether you want your consent to be remote or in person. So remote would be where the participant is at a different location from the researcher. Perhaps they're at home and the researcher's at the clinic, and you're doing it via video chat or over the internet, or in person where both the participant and the researcher are together in the same room, or you might want a mix of both. Another popular requirement would be hybrid mixed paper and eConsent. So you'll have eConsent, but you'll also have the option for participants to complete on paper if perhaps they don't have the facilities to use eConsent or they're just not comfortable with it. So another scenario which we've done once and is also good for perhaps lower risk studies would be open online recruitment. So rather than recruiting your participants through a clinic or a hospital, you simply have an online advertising campaign which channels people through to your sign up page online, and the whole recruitment and screening and consent process happens online. That's something that you can do in REDCap. It's quite well suited to. Another scenario you might have in your study would be you're recruiting dyads. So rather than individual participants, you've got, say, a patient and their carer, or a child and their parent. So you need to recruit 2 people to go through the study, one of whom, perhaps in the case of a patient and carer, might change throughout the life of the study. So that's another scenario that adds a bit of complexity. And one which we'll touch on briefly but not go into too much detail would be offline eConsent, where you are collecting consent electronically but without access to the internet. That requires a separate app and quite a lot of setup, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So yeah, these requirements all have implications. I won't go through all of these now, but just things as simple as the number of forms you'll need, or the branching logic that you'll need, through to which external modules you might want, what your monitoring process will be, etc., etc. So we'll leave the slide in here as a reference point. And another big implication is in terms of time and effort required to build, document, test, train, and or train your staff and maintain this system once it's built. So this can be quite sneaky when someone says, can you just add eConsent to this? It sounds quite simple at first, and it might be if you're just recruiting a participant. However, maybe if you want to have a recruit a participant and have the mix of paper or electronic consent, you've now got 2 different processes to build and document and test. Then once you start adding in a remote or in-person consent choice as well, you've now got 4 different processes to test, and you can kind of see how it goes. So it's not, each new bit of flexibility doesn't just add one thing, it sort of multiplies up all the previous steps. So it gets exponentially harder to build and maintain. So I mean, all this stuff is possible, but it's just worth bearing in mind that the time requirements can quite quickly add up. And yes, for all of these features here. Dyads, again, are interesting because you can have a situation where one person might change throughout the study, so you might need multiple consent forms for one member of the dyad, and then offline consent, as we've mentioned, is a whole different set of problems, things to consider. So yeah, that's again, something to bear in mind. So we're really not trying to put you off, but it is just really worth knowing about all this stuff at the outset, and to get those requirements nailed down as early as possible, because they all have an impact on the amount of time to build, the risks and testing required, the maintenance required, and staff training. And just a warning that it's generally always, it's easier to build things in at the start rather than try and add them on after you've got something, certainly after you've got something up and live and being used. If you can get things in as early as possible, that's ideal. I'm not going to go through this whole checklist, but here's just a hopefully useful checklist on this slide of things to consider when you're building up eConsent. And I will now hand back over to Claire to talk about designing an eConsent system in REDCap.
Thanks, Anthony. So yeah, thought I'd just kind of give a sort of refresh and overview of the different parts of the consent system before we go into some more details. So as Matt mentioned last week, there are the sort of 2 parts to eConsent. There's the conveying information to the participants, which has plenty of advantages using electronic consent. And then there's the documenting process, so documenting the actual form and the researcher and storing it physically, but also I'd kind of add into that the other parts of the process, like monitoring and making sure the participant has a copy, which obviously varies from paper. So starting with conveying information, again, Matt alluded to some of this last week, but eConsent actually gives you a lot of flexibility and extras you can consider and add in, and helps convey information to the participants. So to start with, you can have a summary of the patient information sheet on web pages in the survey, which can kind of be a quick overview. And again, it's the advantage of eConsent is it's all in one place and easy to access. Also talking about accessibility, things like you can, in REDCap, you can highlight fields or key terms with something like a tooltip, or use audio descriptions for participants that have vision or reading difficulties, for example. Other options, you have the other way, as opposed to explaining what's there. If they want more detailed information, you can have files you can download from the page, like a full version of the patient information sheets, or a link to a study website, which again could be handy for future reference for them. Other things about conveying information, you can embed videos in REDCap surveys, so either links out to them or links to YouTube videos, which could explain more about the study or the consent process or anything like that. Another thing which I'm just going to mention here, but not in detail because we haven't actually used, I don't think, in any of our studies in REDCap. Again, like having an information review step, which I think came up at the last session. So obviously REDCap generally, you have your other forms and questionnaires, so you could have a small multiple choice questionnaire or information as an information review step for your participants to check they've understood. Again, with the caveats, you need to think that through quite carefully, what you're trying to achieve and not putting people off or things like that. Another reminder of bits of the system. So we all know it would be covering the same aspects as a paper consent form, which splits into the different sections again. So here we'd have the header, which you can put images in for words for what the actual form is. You'd also have your mandatory statements and your optional statements as in a paper form. You need to think of what fields you'd want for you'd also need, to have fields for documenting who is having the consent, be that text fields or electronic signatures. Again, with the demo, you'll be able to see what that looks like in REDCap later. And then obviously the date as well. So some things I just wanted to highlight here. So with the mandatory section, we tend to use radio buttons, which only have one option of agree, although they can obviously click reset or not agree to them and cease the process there. So the reason for that is, although paper forms often have initials, the guidance says it doesn't require that for eConsent, and it can have implications for monitoring. So either if the typos are very easy on a keyboard, if someone puts it in incorrectly, then that has monitoring issues, what you're going to do about it, that kind of thing, and it doesn't really add any extra accountability, we don't feel. Similarly, checkboxes, which would do exactly the same job in the kind of back end of REDCap, they're kind of formatted a little bit differently to radio buttons and text fields and things. So for just gathering data and referring to it later, it's a bit easier for us to have radio buttons, but you certainly could use either of those if you wanted to. Also, just to highlight, again, I think it was briefly touched on last week. So you've got text fields here, but we've also got an e-signature field, which is, where you use your finger or something to do the squiggle, which I'm sure we've all experienced now. So that's again a bit could be variable with whether you use them or not. Often we actually don't, because again, the guidance allows you to use text fields, and it's not necessarily exactly matching your handwritten signature. So it can depend on the device you're using in your trial. So for example, again, you can test with a demo later, but as you know, trying to sign your name using a mouse isn't always the most reproducible and is quite tricky. Whereas if you have a stylus and a tablet, that might be a lot better. But again, both options are available in REDCap, and depending on your trial, you can use one or both of those. Also, just to highlight in passing, if you can't quite see here because it's very small, but things like the consent date field you can have automatically saved on the page, so you'll know it's correct because it will be audit trailed when the participant actually signed the form, and you can pipe that into a field in REDCap as well. So again, just helping with monitoring and avoiding typos and problems, and or pre-entering data. So very briefly, just to say, obviously, researcher countersigning or person taking consent signing needs to happen. So we tend to suggest using a separate form for this, which is controlled by logic or something, branching logic or some external modules. So this would only be enabled once participant has already completed their section of the form. Again, so you're making sure processes are being followed, an advantage of eConsent. So there are two ways that staff can do that. So they can either log into REDCap using their username and password and look at the online form view, which is a little screenshot there, or they can have a survey link, which doesn't require log on, but would be someone else would need to send them just in case for some reason the person consenting isn't taking part in the rest of the trial or would need access to the rest of REDCap. So storing consent forms, so obviously you'd have site files for your paper ones, but when it's an electronic form, you have some different options. And again, depending on your trial, you might need to think about what's the best way to do for you. So REDCap can generate PDFs automatically on if you use the eConsent framework, which we'll mention later, or you can actually save any form you'd like as a PDF as well as an option in REDCap. So there's two main ways those are stored. So there are things called filed upload fields. So you can, again, I think using external modules, set your PDF to save to a particular field in the database for people to access later. Or there's something called the REDCap file repository where files can be automatically stored, kind of with the caveats that it's more tricky, I think, to control permissions of who can see it. It's a kind of digital either, yes, you can see everybody's consent forms on there or nobody's, which is problematic if you have multi-site studies and you want team to have access to them, in which case this has more fine-grained control. Then the other thing is obviously you might want your sites to have copies, so they can download them from the system and save them locally, or you can print them to a site file as well. So again, just things to consider and think about with your system, what you need it to do and how to set it up. So participant copies, again with paper, that's easy because you photocopy and pass it over, and you just need to think a bit more with the eConsent one. So for eConsent framework, which we'll mention, or again, that is an option, I think, on survey fit forms, you can give a participant an option to download a PDF of any survey at the time. So particularly with remote access, that would be really useful. But you can also have PDFs sent automatically by email using the alerts module. Again, the eConsent framework will let you do that as well. Depending on what you want to send them and when, it can automatically be set up if the participants agreed to it. Equally, printing and posting might need to happen if it's a different, depending on what's available at the site and what staff are comfortable with or can be trained for. So that's that. So going further down, another advantage of eConsent is aiding central monitoring. So you can monitor consent forms easily within REDCap and have a separate page for that. So an advantage of eConsent is that you can add a lot of checks so that there should be fewer errors. So things like required fields, which, sorry, I didn't mention earlier. Yes, for a consent form, we have to set all the fields to be required to continue on or to count as consented. You can also let staff at different locations who should see the data access it, and then they can view completed consent form. You can do things like set buttons that say that yes, this form has confirmed this form has been reviewed, and then when. If it's the sites that can have copies of the form, you can then delete the form centrally or retain the PDF copy, that sort of thing. All controlled within REDCap and have reports to help you do that. And also you can actually monitor paper forms at the same time. Again, with those file upload fields, you can scan a copy of your paper form and upload it so we all allow monitoring in one place. So before we actually talk about any of the other bits of REDCap in more detail, I thought, considering how many people have never used REDCap before, especially, it would be handy to have a sort of demo for you to click through in your own time rather than look at screenshots of me moving the mouse around, for example. So in a minute, Erica's going to link in the chat window a link to a sort of quite basic open online process, public survey consent system in REDCap that I've done just for this talk. So you can scan the QR code, which again, REDCap generates if that's something you weren't aware of, or follow the link. So the form has a short form patient information sheet. It has some optional sections. It has an automated email if you want to have it sent as an email back to you. It also uses the REDCap eConsent framework. So when we refer to some things later about that, it's quite useful to see there. And it also uses 6 external modules to extend functionality to make it a bit easier to use in places. Again, we'll talk about external modules in a little bit later. Just an aside as well, any of your email addresses and things that if you do choose to put it in there, we'll delete all our data and revoke access to the database in 48 hours after next week's talk. But hopefully we can have a couple of minutes maybe to answer if there's any questions in the chat now too. No, Anthony, if you want to.
Yes, so there's some good questions here. Naomi asked, and this is probably not one I don't think that we can answer because it's a bit more sort of regulatory rather than technical, but is there a need for a signature if you don't have a validated signature to match it against if it was audited, such as in the patient record? Which is a very good question. I don't know if Matt or anyone would be able to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I don't know why. So it depends on. Yes, the point of this of collecting the signatures so that you can audit it against an existing one. I don't know in what situation. I mean, it would need to be a pretty low risk trial to not need the signature, and in which case, yes, you wouldn't be needing to compare it against anything. For anything that's higher risk, I can't think of a situation where you wouldn't have anything to compare it against, whether it's in the patient notes or not. I think, yeah, that's not really an answer, but it's more just to need to know more about what you're planning to do, really.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, for our public sign-up low-risk study, we didn't use the electronic signature option because it was, not necessary and was more of a barrier to recruitment because people would be trying to use their mouse to write it. So yeah, that's a good one. Christopher asked about making signature fields mandatory. I think it's the sort of thing obviously you can make them required fields, but you can't out of the box stop the participant from submitting the form without completing it. So naturally you have to check it. A warning will pop up saying they've missed a mandatory field, but they can still submit it. But that is, we have actually developed an external module to stop them doing that. It doesn't currently handle signature fields, but that's something I'm hoping to add to it soon. So yes, that's a good point, and hopefully be releasing a module soon that will help with that. And then sort of talking about security of sending PDFs. I mean, our take on it is that generally we found it to be suitably secure. Obviously, the main areas of insecurity are around making sure you sent it to the right email address in the first place, and the other area of vulnerability largely is if the participant doesn't have a secure password on their email. But sort of for the level of risk that we've done so far, we found it's okay. But as Naomi's mentioned, yes, you've got the Send It encrypted file transfer system that's built into REDCap that you could use. Looks like Naomi's watched Getting On Well with the demonstration too. Yeah, our signature is encrypted in the database. Not as standard. Because it's sort of a hosted solution on a server, generally we would regard the security around the server as being the important thing there. So making sure that it's well secured from both virtual and physical attack, in which case the sort of actual encryption of the files is less crucial. But it certainly is possible to using sort of file system level encryption on your server. So in that case, the images would be encrypted and all the files and all the data would be. Yeah, stop me if we take. So we've only got a few minutes to go through it. I think we should probably carry on. We can answer some of the questions later. Yeah.
And feel free to also in Padlet as well, especially about things like the emails, because it's quite a lot of interesting discussion around that.
Yeah, some really, really good questions coming in. So we'll carry on now, and hopefully we'll cover some of these things later on, and if not, we'll catch up and answer the questions later. So what we're going to go over next are some of the really useful features in REDCap in a bit more depth, and how you can use them to add flexibility and functionality to your eConsent system. This is, again, there's so many different possible scenarios that there may be other things that we're not covering here, but these are just things we have tried and found useful, so we thought we'd share them with you. And do feel free to also chip in if there's other solutions that you've come up with. Do mention that in the chat. So first of all, REDCap eConsent framework. Can't do a talk on this without covering that. It's probably what most people think about for eConsent on REDCap. It adds some useful features, main one probably being the end of survey certification and archival step, which is where once you've completed the eConsent form, and those of you who've done the demo will have seen this, it takes you onto a step where you can review a PDF of your eConsent form, confirm that you're happy with all the details on it, and then download a copy of that PDF consent form if you want to. The framework will also give you the option to add a version of the consent form in the footer of the PDF. You can also select fields for the participant's first name and last name to include in that footer. You can select a signature field as well, and a date of birth field, all sorts of things that you might want to include, checks you might want to include in your eConsent step process. But it is a framework. Again, turning it on won't instantly give you eConsent, but it will give you a lot of tools to use to build an eConsent system. And some of this functionality is now also duplicated by external modules, but yeah, it's a good thing to know your way around, and there's lots of helpful resources on it online as well. We're going to give the REDCap mobile app a quick mention. This is what we referred to earlier on for doing offline eConsent, where you don't have internet access. There is an app you can download that you can install on any Android or iOS device, which enables you to do eConsent to an extent and record data offline. It's a great tool. It does have a lot of, you need some very, very clear processes and make sure that researchers are following them. And you'll need some very good training and good technical support for researchers. Because unlike when you're simply opening a REDCap form on your mobile phone, like some of you might have done in the demo, that is essentially you're online. It's no different to opening on a web browser. The offline device, you have to make sure is kept in sync with the REDCap project. So you set up a project in REDCap, you have to synchronize that to the mobile app, which is a sort of a distinct process you have to do manually. And then you have to make sure that the researchers have then, any data they've collected, they have synced back to your server before you make any changes to your study design. So normal REDCap, you can add fields, remove fields, add forms as you go along, and that won't cause any issues. But with a mobile app, it's really important that you have it synchronized back to REDCap before you add any more data. Otherwise, there can be data conflicts. You have to do manual uploads. It gets quite messy and quite complicated. So you can do it. We'd probably recommend don't unless you really, really have to, and make sure you've got a really good system, clear system in place for people to use. I think that's probably all we want to say on that for now. Useful external modules. So as I mentioned earlier, you can download bits of third-party software that will sort of plug into REDCap and add new features. This has really, really hugely increased the amount of functionality you can get out of REDCap, and that's really useful. So here's a little set of modules that we found useful for eConsent. So for saving PDFs of eConsent forms, there's 3 modules. Save PDF to field, clues in the name there of what that does. It will create a PDF and save it to a file upload field in the participant's record in REDCap. Multi-signature consent and paper trail will do something similar, but they have the ability to merge information from 2 different REDCap instruments or forms into a single PDF, which is really useful for the researcher countersigning. For controlling the flow of the eConsent process, 4 very useful modules. Auto continue logic, which this one and form render skip logic are both a bit like branching logic, but for whole forms. So instead of just hiding and showing individual fields, you can hide and show entire forms. This is useful for like in the demo, where if you answer a question to say, oh, actually, no, I'm not interested in this study, it will take you to a page that just says, okay, thanks for your time. Or if you're not eligible, it will kind of divert you out of the consent process. Whereas if you are interested and you are eligible, it will take you all the way through. So that you can do with auto continue logic. Form render skip logic is more for logged in users as well. So you can, for example, you hide the countersigning form until the eConsent form is complete. Auto form status, that's one of our in-house ones, which we're hoping to release soon onto the repository. That will sort of guide your participants through the form a bit more. It will count down how many questions they've got left to complete, and you can set it so it won't let them submit the form until all the questions are complete, which just is very useful for making sure they don't submit partly completed consent forms. And also hide submit will do something similar. You can hide or show the submit button on the form based on whether certain other fields are visible. So it's kind of like a branching logic for your submit button. For improving appearance and usability, there's a really good module, Survey UI Tweaks, which will let you do things like reword, change the text that's on your submit button, or kind of hide bits of blank space or bits of text that you don't want to appear. It's just useful for making things look nicer and a bit more presentable. Complete row will highlight completed questions in a different color to the uncompleted questions, so it helps people to see where they've got up to in the form. And CSS injector is a really useful tool if you know how to write CSS, which is a language for styling web pages. So changing colors, changing text sizes and button sizes, all sorts of things like that you can write and sort of add to the page. We used it in the demo to make the radio buttons a bit bigger than standard, so they're easier to click and more accessible. This is another one called JavaScript Injector, which is similar but for JavaScript. And then for monitoring, there's two very useful modules, Image Viewer, which will display your uploaded PDF of a consent form, whether that's scanned in from paper or automatically generated. It will display it on the page so you can review it without having to download it and open it in a separate program. So it's really good for sort of data security and just speeds up the process of reviewing. And then Show by Role is a module which will hide and show fields based on the role of the user who is logged in and looking at it. So, for example, underneath your consent form, you might have a question saying, oh, you know, this consent form has been reviewed by, and a name field and a date field. You can show that, perhaps have that only visible to the trial manager and not the person uploading the consent form. So it's just, again, it's a bit easier than having it on a separate form. You can control access to fields on one form to different roles. So those are just our suggestions. Again, do chime in the chat if there's any other useful ones that you've either written or found on the repository, because there are hundreds of them out there and there's a lot of good functionality. Alerts and notifications. This is basically being able to send emails and text messages from REDCap to your participants. Text messages will require a third-party service like Twilio to send. That's not built into REDCap itself, but if you sign up to a Twilio account, you can integrate it easily into REDCap to send text messages. You can send messages to either your study team or to your participants, triggered by events in the database, like certain values being entered or pages being saved, and also dates, so that you can sort of schedule something to send in 3 months or something. This is very useful, we find, for sending survey links to participants for the consent form, sending a copy of the completed consent form to the participant, or alerting the study team that the consent form is ready to monitor. Again, this feature is, for the emails at least, is built into REDCap with a very easy to use interface. Reports, again, another useful REDCap feature. You can, with quite an easy user interface, just put together a report listing, showing bits of information out of the database. For eConsent, it would be useful perhaps to have something that just lists all the participants who have consented and their consent date, which is useful for monitoring. You can also export this to Excel very easily, and you can also do some built-in graphs and charts and stats, but I won't cover that here. And very importantly, for regulatory compliance, is the audit trail. This is a logging system. See what we did there, which is built into REDCap. It'll record anytime any data is entered or edited or deleted, and also any page views, so you can see exactly who has viewed each page and when. You can either see this via a data history button, So on each field there's a data history button which will say, you know, this data was changed by this person at this time. Or there's also a separate logging page where you can look through all of the data for the whole study and filter it by record, user, record, event, or a date range. You can say, yeah, show me all the changes to this record by this user between this date and this date. Really powerful tool for auditing your data. And finally, just there's lots of ways you can make your consent form look nice, which is important because it's one of the one of the very early public participant facing parts of your system. So ensuring that it looks professional, that you've got the same logos for your studies and your sites on there to create that sense of continuity, and like colors and branding and images. So yeah, all that functionality is available, and also making your enhancing your buttons and just things like that to make them more accessible. Right, so I'll hand over to Claire to talk through some examples of eConsent features.
Thanks. So yeah, kind of just to mention again, these are suggestions. There's more than one way you can do this kind of thing, and one solution won't be right for every study scenario. So I thought it'd be useful to actually show some examples, particularly if you're new to REDCap. So this is a nice, really simple one to start off with. So as we said, localizing for sites being important. So this is a screenshot from one of our studies and the designer view in REDCap. So in this example, you have the study logo on the left-hand side, and then you can see some of the different sites here. So in this, you use really quite basic inbuilt REDCap functionality using branching logic and something called smart variables, which kind of deal with the context-aware situations and information. So, for example, you can have it so that the branching logic at the top will say if the current record has a site with the name 01 Norwich, it will display this section. So again, for like contact information on your form, headers, that's one way that you could use REDCap to localize for sites and have extra functionality. So then we're going to move on to some more complex examples. So I'm not going to discuss this information here. It's actually just there for information when you download the slides later. If you want to refer back to it, I'm going to discuss it on the next slide, but it's the countersigning example. So as we've kind of mentioned earlier, we suggest having separate forms for the participant and the researcher to sign. So this is an example of one of the sort of flows of data and control sequences for one of our studies. So in this example, you have a participant consent form. Participant fills that in, and then when it's completed, the form render skip logic external module then recognizes that form is completed, and then enables a countersigning form that the researcher can then fill in. So the person taking consent signs that form, and then I have the multi-signature consent module recognizes that that form's complete and generates a completed consent form with both sections in. In our example, the completed consent form then is uploaded and accessible on the monitoring form via upload field, and also could be sent to the participants as a completed consent form. So this is assuming that you've already screened the participants and you've already got consent to use their email address, or maybe that they've given it in as part of the consent form. And yeah, it just shows you the flow of how consent would happen in this scenario. And then next example is just using the mixed or hybrid system again. So as previously, I'm not going to go through the words on this form. I'm going to show it on a next form, but we're making some assumptions that you're also using countersigning again and central monitoring, and also there's the possibility of remote consent. So in this layout, each of these boxes corresponds to a different form on the database. So the addition, when it's using a mixed module, is having this kind of pre-consent or control form, I'd kind of refer to this as. So depending on what you select on there depends on which of these flows you go through the system. So in this kind of basic example, if you select eConsent, you also need to select on here the most recent, or make sure it's got the right version of the ICF and PIS versions on there. and then it goes to participant consent form, which will show all the fields that are on that form. So that will include optional mandatory statements and all of those sort of things. When the participant completes that, just like the previous example, the counter signature form is made available, and then the monitoring form too. If you select paper on this form, you then only show the optional fields on the consent form. This is because it should already be on the paper version, which is the original, but we might need to have information, we might need the information that's on the optional fields for the rest of the database. So if they want their the results of the study afterwards, or if they've consented to something like extra blood tests or MRI scans, you need to know who your participants are that have that. So having this in one place for both sets of participants we think is useful. Similarly, the consent date can be handy in some things. In this case, we're saying you don't actually need to record that in the database because it's on the paper form and you're uploading it on the monitoring form. So this form never gets shown. And then in the monitoring form, there then becomes a field where they can upload a scanned copy of the consent form, paper consent form too, for monitoring and upload. So that's a kind of very high level, not clicking the buttons, but again, just showing how you set up you could set up your system if you wanted to implement paper and e-consent, and I'm sure other people have different ways, but just handy as an example. I'll get Anthony to finish off now. You're muted, Anthony, sorry.
Thank you. Oh, I was trying so hard not to do that. Right. A couple of things to be aware of that have been, could sort of be pitfalls to fall into. So it's good to have a process around rolling out new versions of patient information sheet and consent form. In REDCap, when you update the consent form, generally that will then be available to everybody at the same time, to all your sites at the same time. So just having a process in place so that the sites are all aware what date it's going to change over is good. Browser compatibility can be an issue. So some browsers, usually Internet Explorer, don't always play well with all of the external modules, especially ones involving inline PDF viewers. So just really important to test, because as we know, quite a few NHS sites are sometimes using older browsers. The eConsent framework can cause issues on mobile devices. Some mobile browsers won't display inline PDFs and will open them in a separate tab, and that can throw people out of the process a bit. So you might not, if you're going to have anticipating a lot of mobile signups, maybe not use that. There is a risk if researchers have edit permissions on the eConsent form that they could accidentally overwrite responses. Again, it sounds scary. It's only a very, very certain scenario this can happen in. And it's fairly rare to happen in production, but if they open the form at the same time as the participant opens it and then save it just after the participant saved it, there are various ways around that. We've got a hook that we've written to stop that from happening, or also just using a separate countersigning form can get around that problem to a large extent. It's just something to be aware of. Occasionally, participants will misunderstand the process. Again, other than sort of clarifying it as much as possible. We did have one, which was really surprising. We sent out the eConsent form. They downloaded it, printed it off, filled it in by hand, took photos of it and emailed the photos back to us. Again, it's only happened once, but I guess when people are really used to a paper-based process, that can happen. And also for resending emails, it's just worth being aware when you send out a consent form link by email, it may either, you could have made a typo and it doesn't get delivered, or it gets caught in a spam filter. So setting up your alerts and notifications to resend each time a page is saved can help that. So you can go in, change the email address, save the page again, and it'll send the form again. Those little tips like that, which can show you in more detail next week again, if you're interested. Also, to get more help once you're into the process of setting up, probably first place I would usually go to would be the REDCap forum, which again, hundreds or thousands of users on there, very helpful bunch of people who've been through this scenario a lot of times. The UKCRC REDCap user group. If you're a current REDCap user in the UK, do email this address to join that group, which has regular meetings and a sort of email forum to discuss issues. Google, lots of good resources online, especially we'd like to recommend the ITHS website in the States, have some really good high quality videos and published resources on how to use REDCap. The Trilaborate forum that we've mentioned before, we're going to post some items to, some questions to sort of have ongoing discussion on there. And of course, our next webinar which will be next week, next Monday at 12 till 1 on the 28th of February. We've put in the link and also put in the chat the link to sign up to that. So that will allow you to sign up. It's also going to have the videos from previous sessions on there. If you've got any topics you'd like us to think about before we discuss them next week, do either put them in the chat here or on the feedback form, and we'll have a think and see if we can help at all. And yes, if you could complete the feedback form after this session, the link will be going in the chat in a moment. That would be really helpful. Thank you very much. I am sorry we have left a very little time for questions, but we might be able to just get through a few. If not, we will go through them and answer them and email around some answers. I can see some excellent questions coming in, and so also people really helpfully answering those. Online, I mean, I don't know. We've got so little time to get through these now. I think we might just have to sort of reply later on. But again, yes, we'll suggest the Trilaborate forum. Interesting question about, is form render skip logic being brought inside REDCap soon? I think it is actually. We're a little bit behind on the REDCap version and upgrading soon. So yes, I think that might be one of the things that's going to be in the core code soon. And yeah, Twilio GDPR issues, that's something that has been raised before. We've run it past our ethics review boards. They've been quite happy with it, that no participant clinical data is being stored in the US, and REDCap automatically erases the logs on Twilio. So they've been fairly happy with that. But again, it might differ slightly based on your ethics board. But no, we have been through that process and they've been quite happy with it. So, but yeah, other providers are available unless you want to use the conversation functionality in REDCap. You can send your links via other systems, like what's the one we use?
Text Anywhere.
Thank you. Text Anywhere. Yes, that's a UK-based option. Right, I think probably time to say thank you very much for coming along, everybody. Are there any last things we need to say?
I don't think so. I'll just turn off the recording now. Hold on.
Excellent.